Standing by right now with Governor Greg Abbott. Phil,
go.
Can you hear us? Go ahead. We'd love to hear what the governor has to say.
Yeah, John and Sally, thanks so much. We can hear you okay, and I'm here with Governor Greg Abbott. Thanks for joining us.
Sure, of course. Thank you.
Talk me just, I guess, how you heard the news of what happened overnight.
Well, listen, I was in constant contact with Steve McCraw, the director of the Texas Department of Public Safety. We had known and had been tracking the suspect for about 24 hours. And so we knew something was going to happen. We simply didn't know when it was going to happen. And obviously it broke when it did. And so we were on top of it. We were following him. We knew we were going to be able to apprehend him. We just didn't know when.
And what did you think when you heard that he was deceased, that a bomb exploded, and when the SWAT team arrived? What did you think when the situation calmed down?
Well, for the end product, we obviously felt a sense of relief knowing that the cause of the danger was no longer there. Obviously, no one wanted to see it end the way that it did end. With an explosion like that, we wish we had been able to apprehend him still alive. But the good news is that the danger that has been causing so many people in Austin and across Texas to be so concerned has now been eliminated with one caveat, and that is there's still two things we don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know whether or not he had preset or mailed any other bombs before he was apprehended. We also have not fully been able to rule out whether or not there were any other accomplices who may be a part of this who still pose a danger. So those two things still have to be discovered, and we need to get to the bottom of over the next 24 to 48 hours.
And what can you tell us about the suspect, Mark Anthony Condit?
Well, I'm going to tell you what I know, and understanding that we continue to generate information. This is my most recent information, and that is obviously he was a white male. My information is that he was unemployed. He was not a former member of the United States military, according to my information, and that he was unemployed and did not have a criminal record, according to the best we can tell. So there's seemed to be very little information about him. We do, I think, have access, or will today have access to his social media accounts. It probably is not going to be the same type of situation as what we saw in the aftermath of the shooting in Nevada, where the person's past history was wiped clean. I think we will be able to piece together the puzzle of who this man was, why it is he did what he did, and that will resolve a lot of the uncertainty that still exists.
Do you get the impression that he acted alone?
Everything that we have right now shows he acted alone, but I would call that a premature judgment. We still need to put together pieces of information today and tomorrow to find out whether or not there could have been somebody else acting with him.
Now, we've heard that he had roommates. What kind of information would they have that's important, or were they involved in your idea?
Well, they would see his comings and goings. They might know whether or not they had observed any bomb-type materials whatsoever. We actually, at this point in time, are unable to announce where it was that he was making these bombs. Was it at his house where he had those roommates? Was it at this motel? Was it some other location where he was making them? And so as we continue to talk with his roommates, we'll learn more about what exactly they knew and what they can share with us.
And you said you were watching him for 24 hours. What exactly could you tell us? How was he originally found? Can you tell us anything about that?
Well, there were multiple pieces of information that came together that eventually led to his arrest. I'm going to tell you what's been reported publicly, meaning that I'm not going to share with you anything that would otherwise be secret. And that is, it was revealed that his cell phone had pings on it at the various different locations. That was one piece of information. Obviously, when he showed up wearing the disguise, there were reports about some information that witnesses were able to share with us. We have information about him going to other stores and locations, making purchases, and all these were pieces of the puzzle that allowed us to piece together who he was, that identified him, that allowed us to be able to begin following it.
For someone who's just tuning in, tell us a little bit about that disguise. What was interesting, or how did we find out about that?
Well, multiple ways. I mean, the disguise was highly unusual, to say the least, and because it was unusual, it kind of alerted some witnesses that this seemed like it wasn't right, and some witnesses were able to identify the vehicle that he was in that matched up with other information that we had about the vehicle that he had. He had two vehicles, and so through that we were able to trace more information about who he was, and what his driver's license was, and different things like that.
And what was the disguise? Can you tell us?
Well, he had a crazy, I think it was a blonde wig, as well as gloves, in ways that he thought was going to camouflage who he was. And it kind of did camouflage who he was, because we had some photographs that didn't match up perfectly because of his disguise. But because of other information, we were able to piece together exactly who he was.
Can you give Texans and people who live in Austin an idea of how much danger is still out there? We don't know all the information of what he was doing up until his arrest. How many bombs do you think are still out there?
Well, importantly, the primary cause of the danger is now deceased, and so the magnitude of future dangers has now been reduced. It's important for everybody who's watching this right now to understand that we are completely unable to rule out the existence of any other bombs anywhere, whether it be in the Austin area, or it could have been mailed to other locations. It could have shown up in a place like that FedEx location in Schertz, Texas, et cetera. And so everybody needs to remain on guard, remain very vigilant about anything that could cause any type of harm whatsoever. People should treat this as they would a situation that you hear these reports when you are in an airport. If you see a bag that is not yours, that has been left alone, don't pick it up, report it to someone. Same thing is true for everybody in the entire Austin area.
We do have a question from in the studio. John and Sally, you have a question?
Correct.
That I can relay to the governor?
Please do, Phil. NBC News is reporting that the suspect ordered exotic batteries to make his bombs, and that was his signature trait. Exotic batteries from Asia. Can the governor confirm that, or what does he know?
I guess NBC is reporting that to make the bombs, he was using exotic batteries. Is that something that you've heard or can confirm at all?
I cannot confirm that about what he was putting into the bombs, and that'll be one of the things that we learn. But remember this, and that is one of the oddities about this is it seemed like he was using different types of bombing strategies, and that's one thing that threw some people off. And so we'll learn more about the different types of bombs that he was making. We'll learn if he had a big stash of other type of bombing equipment, and the future danger that he posed had he not been arrested and apprehended like it was.
Now, APD received 1,200 calls in, more than 1,200 calls into suspicious packages. What does that tell you?
Well, it shows, for one, the people in the Austin area had heeded the warnings about if you encounter a package that you don't know what it is, to call police. And that's exactly why the state of Texas authorized $260,000 for bomb detection equipment, so that we would be able to assist APD in trying to scan and screen and X-ray all of these packages, so we could rule out the possibility of them being a bomb.
So the producer in my ear is telling me that there is a suspicious package call, reports of it, of another one in McKinney Falls. I mean, do you know anything about that, or does that reinforce just there are going to be more of these suspicious package calls out there?
I think that we will have for several days lingering concerns and calls come in about suspicious packages, and until we get back to a sense of calm and normal, until we go several days without any bombs being identified, there could be suspicious packages that do turn out to be bombs. Another problem that we deal with in situations like this that we cannot rule out at this point in time, and that is sometimes some copycat criminals crop up, and we need to see whether or not there will be any copycat bombings like this.
Do you think law enforcement performed as everybody expected in this, with APD kind of led the show and everything else, DPS, FBI assisting when needed?
I think this was the best of the best. APD and the chief did a fabulous job. The federal officials who came in, and the number of them and the quality of them that came in was superior, all working collaboratively, as well as the State Department of Public Safety, as well as the Texas Rangers. This was a team effort, and it shows the results that you can achieve so much more faster and more effectively when you have law enforcement working together collaboratively.
As we go forward in the investigation in this process, what are you going to be looking for?
We're going to be looking for several things. First and foremost, we want to look for any information that we can get a hold of to rule out anybody else being involved. We're going to be looking for information that will lead to, like, when his house is searched, that we may, and when his social media is searched, we may be able to find that he either planned or has already placed bombs in other locations. So that's our most immediate urgency, is that right now. But then we'll be looking together to form the information about why this happened. And so whenever we learn about a bombing suspect and why they did something like this, it'll go into our database that helps us form profiles, so we're able to better detect crimes like this in advance and try to prevent them or be able to respond to them more quickly.
APD has been very careful not to call this domestic terrorism because there hasn't been a motive detected yet. Have you heard any motive at all, or is that just the big question that we're all asking now?
Motive is a big issue. I mean, obviously there was terror, and seems like it's terrorism, but for something to be categorized as terrorism, you have to get into the motive. And we don't know if this was a political agenda or whether or not it was a person who was just totally crazy, or if he had identified certain people that he wanted to harm, or did he really just want to stoke terror? If his goal was to stoke terror, then he is a terrorist. And if his goal was something else, then it may be a different type of crime.
Well, Governor, thanks so much for your time.
Sure. Thank you.
John, Sally, we'll send it back to you in the studio.